Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. This is the Health in the Public Interest Master of Science Programs weekly seminar. A couple of announcements. Next week, there's no seminar, and then our last seminar for the semester will be the following Wednesday. So we have one more after today, 2 weeks from today, and then we'll see you in mid-January roughly, but you'll get an announcement if you've attended these in the past. So thanks to everyone who's here today to hear Dr. Tom Sherman. He'll be introduced in a moment by Rayanna. I just want to say a little bit about how we're going to do things this morning. This is the Health in the Public Interest Program, which is a program that emphasizes non-medical determinants of health, including advertising, marketing influences, environmental influences, health disparities, etc. And we aim to train people to be advocates for a better healthcare system that takes into account all these social determinants of health. So this afternoon, our seminar will be given by Dr. Sherman. As I said, he's going to be introduced in just a second by Rayanna, one of our students. And then she's going to moderate the session specifically once Dr. Sherman is finished. We're going to take questions. Rayanna is going to take questions from the students first, and then the general audience. And Dr. Sherman and Rayanna will be looking at the chat if you put anything there in the meantime. Although we do encourage students to unmute and ask their questions face to face. But thanks again, everyone, and I'll turn it over to Rayanna.
All right, thank you, Dr. Myers. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker for today's session. As Dr. Myers said, it's Dr. Thomas Sherman. He is a biochemist, molecular neuroendocrinologist, and a professor at Georgetown in the Department of Pharmacology and Physiology, whose expertise delves into the intricate connections between nutrition and health. Dr. Sherman is a passionate advocate for evidence-based nutrition advice in healthcare. As an educator, he is dedicated to shaping a new generation of physicians and healthcare workers capable of guiding patients towards healthier lifestyles, embodying the principles of good nutrition, physical activity, and weight management. The title of Dr. Sherman's talk today, The Dieting Industrial Complex, promises a captivating exploration of the factors contributing to the rise of ultra-processed foods, the ascent of big food, and the absorbing of the diet industry by food corporations. Adding a colorful, flavorful twist to the scientific palette, Dr. Sherman is also passionate about cooking, orchestrating the kitchen for his family with an innate ability to predict the success of a recipe. Outside of the culinary realm, he finds expression in cycling and formally running, a testament to his resilience despite challenges like arthritis. As a scientist, seasoned cook, and avid cyclist, Dr. Sherman brings a multifaceted perspective to the intersection of science, health, and overall well-being. Without further ado, I'll hand off to Dr. Sherman as he leads an enlightening and thought-provoking session, providing insights into the complex dynamics of our dietary landscape.
Oh, well, thank you, Rayanna. That's very sweet. And thank you for the invitation. I very much enjoy speaking to the students in the HAPI program and to students in general. You know, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, but we will get into the actual talk here in a second. You know, many years ago, when the HAPI program was under development, and Dr. Fu Berman and Dr. Myers were sort of talking about it, you know, Dr. Fu Berman asked if I'd be interested in teaching the course in food politics. You remember that, Adrian? And it's something I'm actually very interested in. And even though it never really happened, I mean, I didn't quite have the bandwidth for it, and we just don't need that many more elective courses. But it's a topic that I always pay attention to, and I keep a folder on my computer of potential topics in a food politics course. And this is one of them that popped up this past summer. I was reading a book by Michael Moss, and he introduced this topic to me, and and gave some really great examples, which I'll share with you. And I looked up some more, and it's a fascinating topic because we're all interested in conflicts of interest. We're interested in bias. We're interested in big whatever, big pharma, big food, big dieting. And so this sort of takes all of these together. So let me start. I have no conflicts of interest. I have no conflicts of interest with the food companies or pharmaceutical companies or any FDA regulated products. I don't need to describe the health situation that we're in this country over the last 50 years as our population has gotten increasingly heavier. And one of the consequences of this increase in body weight that the population is experiencing is an explanation. Not so much something to blame, but partly, but how is it that over 1 or 2 generations, we can, as a population, go from, back in the 70s, where it was well less than 10% of the population had BMIs over 30, to today, where it can be as much as 45 or 50% in some states. And the explanations are hard to come by. Obesity is not disproportionately an issue with the poor. Obesity is not disproportionately an issue with the less educated. And so what other explanations can there be? I mean, little things apply for many, many different topics. One of the current trends over the last half a dozen years has been the rise of blaming carbohydrate intake. And this idea that if you gain weight, it's because of the carbs that you're eating. And that has been thoroughly disproven by a number of researchers. And here's a study, for example, by Gardner, who compared the Atkins, the very low carb diet, with the Zone diet, which is sort of moderately low, versus the Learn diet, which is high in carbs, versus a vegetarian diet which is extremely high in carbs. And each one of these bars is a single participant in this 12-month study comparing these. And you could see that no matter what diet you're on, no matter what macronutrient you're targeting, that you can lose weight, and that under typical dieting conditions, when people try to lose weight, some people lose a lot of weight, a lot of people lose some weight, and a few unfortunate people gain weight. And that's just the way that voluntary caloric restriction works. And so is it our genetics? I mean, could it be that our genetics is explaining why weight gain has happened so much? But really, over the last 50 years, can we target genetics? Well, no, but not completely no, because genetics dictates how we respond to an environment that we're in. So let me give you an example of that. So here, let me set the scene. Okay, so here it is. It's the 1980s, for example, and so the average BMI of adults in the 1980s was just less than 25. So here, let me get my pointer here. So you can see that the average BMI during this period was right around here. And so there's this distribution around this point when about 15% of the population is considered obese. And then let's redo this again, the same survey, this National Health Survey that takes a snapshot of body weights was redone in 2020, 21. And you could see that, that there's a shape-shifted curve into this dashed line. And the population mean now is approximately 30, with over 40% of adults in the range of obesity. So over this time period, there's no way this was genetics, right? Well, it definitely can be. And differences between our today, differences here can be explained by lots of different things that we inherit from our parents. And the kinds of genes that we inherit from our parents sort of dictate in what way we can influence our behavior and how to. So for example, so let me give you an example. So here's Jasper. So Jasper is 20 years old and it's 1980. And so he's over here, he has a BMI of around 21. And what happens over the ensuing 40 years? So Jasper did what a lot of people did. He gained weight as he went into adulthood. And so now he's 60 years old. He's in the overweight category of BMI. And so is his weight gain due to his genes or is it due to the environment? Well, Jasper's genome didn't change and the environment undoubtedly did. So it's the environment, right? Well, wait a minute. So here Jasper didn't gain as much weight as some of his peers. And many of his peers over the same period, despite living in the same city, with the same education, in the same environment. And so his genes dictated how he responds to the environment that has changed over those 40 years. And another person with the same body weight 40 years ago could remain lean or gain significantly more weight. So it's in genetics and it's in the environment, it's both. And it's exactly these kinds of gene environment interactions that allow us to see massive population shifts in body weight over relatively short periods of time due to environmental changes. And still allowing us to explain statistical heterogeneity and heritability with genetics. So this is fascinating. So it's sort of allowing us to target the environment in part and realizing that how we respond to that environment is part of our genetics. And so when we play this blame game of how do we explain weight gain over 40 or 50 years, we can say that it isn't predominantly socioeconomic status. It certainly isn't overwhelmingly education. It's certainly not carbs. And that is genetics and the environment. So what do I mean by the environment? What do I mean by how we're responding to this environment that has evolved over the last 40 years or so? And this environment is really a corporate environment that has changed the way we eat. So every income level, every education level has fallen prey to what I would call an obesogenic environment. We are surrounded by inexpensive, flavorful foods, and that food has become a part of almost every human activity. We eat when we're socializing, we eat when we're studying, we eat when we're bored, we eat when we're stressed, we eat when we're watching television, and when nearly 75% of American adults are overweight or obese, then that means these 75% of the people are not navigating the system successfully, which makes the system the problem, not the humans. Dr. Fu Berman and Dr. Myers are very familiar with a term called structural violence. And it's somewhat of an archaic term, but but it still applies today. And what structural violence is when people are harmed because of the way the system is designed. And so I think these data would suggest that people are being harmed because of our food environment. And so what is it exactly that happened 40 or 50 years ago that contributed to this structural violence that's harming Americans? And it's this obesogenic environment. Starting around 1960, we started producing more food than people could be expected to eat. And so we switched from a pull environment in which our energy intake was dictated by our energy expenditure to a push phase where energy intake is driving energy expenditure. And these foods are being marketed to us. And we can't pretend like we can no longer respond to marketing. So what happened in the late 50s and 60s? Well, when the US entered World War II, the government sort of suspended the development and production of food equipment. But with the end of the war, this production turned to technology to help us create foods much more inexpensively, much more efficiently. And this technology that helped us through World War II was spurring the development of processed foods. And this so-called green revolution that happened in the late 50s and 60s sort of happened to industrial farming. Earl Butz, who was the Nixon era Secretary of State during during this period, was the Secretary of Agriculture, and he had a mandate that he was telling farms to get big or to get out. And under this paradigm, farms started to coalesce, they started to consolidate. Farmers bought industrial-sized equipment to take advantage of all of these subsidies that were coming in to try to spur the development of food and to decrease the price of foods that were happening after the Second World War. And that led to many different factors. The subsidized gas, subsidized diesel fuel made industrial farming artificially inexpensive. And foods were marketed at prices that didn't reflect the real cost of these foods. We call it the real cost of cheap foods. And what do I mean by the real cost? You know, farm workers were not being paid a living wage. And when you don't pay people a living wage, who picks up that extra cost? Well, it's going to be social welfare programs and SNAP benefits, and that the federal government and states sort of take over where industry is not paying a living wage. Who pays for the environmental damage? Well, it's not going to be people paying for the food, and it's not going to be the corporations. Again, it's not reflected in the cost of that food. And so food companies realized that they were not being held responsible or liable for the harms that were being caused to their practice. And it's one of the realities of capitalism is that when pricing doesn't feature in the total cost of a practice, it's too easy for bad actors to privatize these gains and to socialize the cost. And so they were privatizing the profits, but that the real cost of foods were being socialized to the government and to the people. So what do I mean by that? Well, food became very cheap. You know, back in 1900, the average family was spending not quite 50% of their income on food. By 1950, that had dropped to about 30%. And with the turn of the 21st century, we're now spending about 13% of our income on average on food. and half of that is spent on food outside of the home. And one of the dirty secrets about spending half of your food budget outside of the home is that when you eat outside of the home, that automatically means you're overeating, because we've gotten used to large portion sizes as food has become increasingly inexpensive. Um, and so um, and so 7% of the average family budget now is spent on food at home. And so we can spend, and so what's the consequence of that? Well, over the last 3 decades at least, the American men have increased their caloric intake by 7%, and American women have increased their caloric intake by 22%. And so if your weights were stable up until this point and you're increasing caloric intake, then you're gaining weight. And so part of the question then becomes, well, why are we gaining weight? What is it that's contributing to it? Why are we gaining weight? And that is what happens when you make ultra processed foods. Ultra processed foods right now comprise nearly 58% of the total energy intake for the average American. And that includes about 90% of the energy intake from added sugars. And ultra processed foods constitute about nearly 70% of the caloric intake for teenagers. And so, well, what's so bad about that? I mean, we're used to ultra processed foods. These companies are making very delicious foods that are very inexpensive. What's the downside of that? So what are ultra processed foods? Well, ultra processed foods really are just foods that we can't make in our own kitchens. And that there is sort of a ranking system about how foods work. And minimally processed foods are going to be sort of mostly the whole foods, the apples, the corn on the cob, the grains that we eat. These are minimally processed. Now, processed foods have been with us forever, ever since the First World War, really once canning became safe. And so minimally processed foods are going to be canned corn, for example, or frozen corn, or things that you could do in your kitchen or in your home kitchen to preserve foods. But ultra processed foods are going to be the equivalent of Doritos to corn, or whatever these are, Fruit Loops to oats. And that these are foods that, for all practical purposes, we can't make in our own kitchens. And so what happens when you eat ultra processed foods? Well, what happens is really explained well by Michael Moss in 2 of his books that are just fascinating. I read Hooked this past summer. I read Salt, Sugar, and Fat a number of years ago. And what, as an investigative reporter, what he has done so well is sort of explained in unfortunate detail about how scientifically these companies pursue the production of very tasty foods. They aim for something that they call the bliss point. And that is by using human surveys and panels and tasting groups, they try to identify that exact combination of sugar, salt, and fat that is the most enticing for humans, and to what we, that for what our brains then respond to with a reward sensation. And so these are foods that are extremely profitable because we come back to them over and over again. And the consequence of that is weight gain. Now, this was shown in very great detail by a study by Kevin Hall, a colleague of ours at the NIDDK. And he's been doing a lot of these clinical trials with diet. And what's so nice about his setup at NIDDK is he can bring participants into the clinic and keep them there and have complete control over what they're eating. So you don't have to worry about the whether or not their surveys or forms are being filled out correctly. And what he did in this study is he brought in I think about 60 or 80 people, and he kept them in the clinic for a month. And he divided them into two groups, and one group was exposed to a cafeteria where they ate mostly unprocessed diets. And then the other group was exposed to an ultra-processed diet. And they went to pretty considerable lengths to try to match the taste, the appeal of these two diets. And then after 2 weeks, then these groups were switched so that the former unprocessed diet was eating ultra processed and vice versa. And what they noticed is that when they were eating ultra processed foods, they consumed 500 calories more per day. I was astounded by this. So they were not only eating 500 calories more per day, but they were doing so in a much faster, they were eating more quickly, consuming it more quickly. And it just sort of matched the intentions, you have to believe, of these ultra processed food manufacturers. And so that during these very brief 2-week periods, those on the ultra processed food diet were gaining a little bit of weight, and those on the whole food diet were losing a little bit of weight. And you can only imagine what would happen if this reflected your diet over a lifetime or over many decades. And so one of the implications, and again, they're continuing their studies trying to figure out why this is, but one of the implications is that one of the contributing factors to this population weight gain since the development of ultra-processed foods after World War II is that we're eating these foods in a manner that is difficult to control. And so why is that? He's really trying to investigate more. Now, it's not only us that is observing that we're gaining weight. It's not only the health professionals that are observing that we're gaining weight, but the companies were observing that we're gaining weight. And so, as Michael Moss explained in his book, Hooked, this was how the great dieting industrial complex was born, because companies spearheaded by Heinz recognized that they needed to participate in industries that not only were contributing, they feared, to weight gain, but to help losing weight. And so Heinz was a company that was instrumental in the development of frozen foods. They developed the Ore-Ida division that sort of developed the tater tots, the golden crinkles, the bold and zesty. They sort of turned our kitchens into fast food restaurants by developing these frozen foods. But they were interested in sort of developing foods that were part of dieting as well to help us lose weight. And this happened when they had their eyes on Weight Watchers, or really they had their eyes on Foodways National. Foodways National was a company with, so in 1978, with obesity rates increasing, Heinz wanted to acquire a company that made frozen meals with fewer calories. And microwaves were becoming popular. And, microwaves went from, 670-pound behemoth to kitchen counter things for much more affordable, and people were buying them like crazy. And as they became more popular, frozen foods offered more alternatives than canned foods. And so Foodways National was a large company that made frozen foods that were being used by many different companies, many different customers, including Weight Watchers. And Weight Watchers had millions of devoted followers that were ready to consume these products. They had, I think, at this point, they had about 27 million women in the age group of 25 to 55. But Weight Watchers had veto power over the purchase of Foodways National. And so Heinz convinced Weight Watchers that they would be a good steward of Foodways National. And ultimately, they ended up buying Weight Watchers and Foodways National. So Heinz Company bought Foodways National for about 50 million. In 1978, they bought Weight Watchers for 71 million. I think in 1994, they ended up buying Budget Gourmet, another line of frozen meals. And so with that, they were getting into the diet industry. And Heinz realized that they were now, Foodways National was making the foods that were contributing to weight gain, and now they controlled Weight Watchers that were helping people lose weight. And Heinz also realized that this was all marketing, and that selling spaces within a classroom is the same way as selling anything. And so they started hiring people that used to work for fast food companies, that used to work for Burger King and Pizza Hut. They would hire these people to manage Weight Watchers meetings, and they became extremely profitable. So at first, it wasn't working. You know, at first they sort of introduced this line of low-calorie cheesecakes and carrot cakes, and those didn't flop. So what they did is they added more sugar, more sweeteners, and they created a lineup of chocolate mousse and brownies and cheesecakes. They started using the word indulgent or very indulgent, which honestly is one of my least favorite words when it comes to cooking, or and what does it mean to be indulgent? And they created this ad that it's a myth that dieting has to be hard, and that dieting has to mean that you're eating, you know, unpalatable foods, and you can eat these foods and consume fewer calories and lose weight. And so under Heinz, sales of Weight Watchers rose from about $90 million in 1982 to over $300 million in 1989. And so what was it that Heinz bought Weight Watchers for 71 million in 1978, and when they finally sold it in 2005, they sold it for $735 million. So that was a 10 times markup, and it was extremely profitable. And then Kraft and Heinz merged in 2015, creating even a bigger company. And so the brilliance of this move, of these moves by Heinz, was not lost on the competition. So what happened? What happened after Heinz bought Weight Watchers and Foodways National? Well, it's kind of amazing. So Nestle, which we're very familiar with, which makes chocolate bars and Hot Pockets, microwave pockets, they developed lean cuisine, and then they bought Jenny Craig, a meal preparation company, in 2006. Conagra Foods, which makes banquet pot pies, which I'm pretty sure I lived on when I was a graduate student. And they made Ready Whip and Fiddle Faddle. That's that popcorn snack. So then they launched their own frozen meals called Healthy Choice in 1998. Kraft known for their macaroni and cheese and Kool-Aid and Oreo cookies, started producing a line, cereals, wraps, and frozen foods under the South Beach diet label, which is, not quite like Atkins. It's a little bit more vegetable friendly than Atkins. Unilever, which bought Ben and Jerry's back in 2000, then bought Slim Fast. So they now had a diet company that specialized in meal replacements that were really not that different from Ben and Jerry's. And then the Roar Capital Group, which owns a lot of mall fast foods like Auntie Anne's soft pretzels and Cinnabon, and then fast food companies like Arby's and Carl's Jr. They bought the Atkins diet brand in 2010. And so all of these food companies realized that there was profits to be made in marketing food to people, and there were profits to be made in helping these people lose weight by selling diet foods to them. And that with increasing consolidation, many of these brands that we grew up with, at least, Dr. Myers and Dr. Fu Berman and others of our age, are disappearing into these large food corporations that have tremendous control over the food environment within the United States. But it didn't just end with that. Now there are new entrants in the dieting industrial complex. Noom appeared a few years ago. There are millions of Americans now that have paid Noom an average of $24 a month to help them lose weight and manage their diabetes and stress. And despite, this sort of holistic message, Noom is just the most recent entrant into this old diet industry, built on consumer desperation, trying to lose weight. Noom, I think, generated $400 million during their first year in 2020, and they're still expecting to have an IPO. I have my suspicions that this IPO is never going to happen. I think the IPO market hasn't really recovered, but they're expecting an IPO, and I've sort of kept my eyes on that. And the other thing that Noom is taking advantage of with other entrants is that they're taking advantage of what they call the wellness industry. And wellness is one of these terms that is replacing, I get the impression, dieting, and that wellness is sort of these companies realizing that people are tired of dieting and they want wellness. And so it's taken on all these different meanings, like vitamin companies are selling wellness, and mattress companies are selling wellness. And our companies all have wellness programs. And whether or not, it's not clear that these programs work, but the population seems to be buying into this concept of wellness. The other new entrance here, which I find somewhat despicable, is this emphasis on precision medicine, and that they're trying to convince us that knowledge of our specific individual genes will make treatments more targeted and by implication more effective, making weight loss finally work. But really, I just see it as a medicalization of body weight. And these companies offer genetic tests to support their concept of precision medicine. They're promising to provide information about your risk of weight gain and your ways to be able to lose weight. And honestly, we're just not there yet. We are not capable of looking at our genome and predicting how our genes interact in such a manner that we can tailor diets or eating patterns that are in any way going to improve our weight. Just like we're not in a position to look at our microbiome and predict if we can lose weight or what we should be eating or what we're missing out on. We're just not there yet. And these companies are just taking advantage of people. And that's because, of course, dieting is big business. And it's just a tremendously profitable business, as these food companies realize. And now these companies are starting to get into the obesity drug market. I mean, these obesity drugs are all over the news now. They are increasingly profitable. They're already like changing the entire environment of countries that house these companies. And bariatric surgeries are becoming completely normal. They're very effective, as are many of these diet drugs now based on glucagon-like peptide-1 receptor agonists. But they're just becoming normalized. And now these diet companies, like Weight Watchers, are beginning to sell weight loss drugs. So companies that own Weight Watchers are then getting into the telehealth weight loss drug market. In just earlier this year, Weight Watchers bought telehealth startup Sequence. And this is going to give Weight Watchers customers access to Wegovy, one of the GLP-1 receptor agonists that's all like Ozempic. And Noom has started a new service called Noom Med. And so if you're a member of Noom Med, which is $49 a month, which is only available to members of Noom Weight, which is $42 a month, then you can qualify to be prescribed weight loss medications like Ozempic or Wegovy or any of the other GLP-1 receptor agonists. And so we're dealing with a dieting industrial complex that not only involves the foods that people are eating, the frozen foods and dieting foods that people are using to try to lose weight, and now the weight loss drugs to try to further medicalize the way our body weights are working. There's a wave of startups that are also selling these weight loss drugs that are going to become part of the same complex. Calibration Health, for example, served over 20,000 people in New York. And these are sort of online companies that are created to be able to market weight loss drugs. Calibration Health is focusing on these GLP-1 receptor agonists like Ozempic, whereas Found Health, based in San Francisco, is sort of focusing on a lot of these older weight loss drugs that are where weight loss is sort of a side effect of whatever they were designed for, whether or not it was neurodegeneration or some other illness, as well as some of these other newer drugs. It's hard to know. I mean, it's really hard for me to know how effective these companies are. The feedback, especially for Found Health, has not been very good. Calibration Health seems to have a better reputation, but the degree of follow-up that you can offer for this many people over this short period of time taking these many different drugs is really difficult to figure out. And Adrian points out rightly that Farmed Out has published an article called Fat and Fiction about the truth about these weight loss drugs. And it's early days yet, but these drugs are changing the way people think about fatness, and it's not clear that they're thinking about it constructively. And again, I can't help but say, like we've medicalized women's health, we've medicalized childbirth, we're medicalizing body weight, and it's hard to see that this is going to end particularly well. So part of the issue, of course, is that these companies are so big now and so consolidated that they are seemingly untouchable. You know, in the 1980s, tobacco giants like Philip Morris and R.J. Reynolds acquired major food companies like Kraft, which is now Kraft Heinz and General Foods and Nabisco, allowing these tobacco firms then to dominate America's food supply and to reap billions in profits that were formerly realized by still very profitable cigarettes. I mean, smoking is still the #1 cause of preventable death in this country. And it's what, 2023? I mean, it's hard to believe. And so even though these tobacco companies have spun off most of their food companies, you know, their legacy remains. And one of the things that I really like about this documentary, Food Incorporated, and I'm sure some of you remember Food Incorporated, is that they make clear that whenever you buy a product, you're voting for that product. And the other thing they made clear is that, you know, we thought the tobacco companies were untouchable, and really it was legislation that, or really the courts that allowed us to begin to hold them responsible for the harms that they were causing. And you just have to think that that's the way it's ultimately going to be with these food companies. And that perhaps we can at some point hold them responsible. Now, many states have legislation not holding these companies explicitly responsible. And so there's going to have to be some legislation that enables us to be able to do that. Now, so I read a paper early this morning. It was actually published early this morning. I don't want you to think that I'm giving you old data here. I am a fairly, I read the literature faithfully every morning. And this morning, a paper came out in a journal called Globalization and Health. And they talked about what is the purpose of ultra-processed foods and this concept of financialization. And it was really interesting. So, you know, here I am early in the morning reading this paper, realizing that I really need to mention it in this talk. And, you know, and part of the issue is that ultra-processed food corporations defend their tremendous profits by claiming that they serve the interests of multiple stakeholders, including offering jobs and paying taxes, and they're responsible to their investors, and that they're contributing to the sustainable and food environment because people are going hungry. But what this paper did is sort of investigated these claims and whether or not financialization is really the driving force behind these profits. And so I had to look up what financialization is, and it's really a method that looks at value through extracting money from the real economy, you know, what we think of as creating goods and services and customers, and to what is the financial economy. You know, the section of the economy that solves dealing with transactions involving money and other financial assets. And so what they found in this paper is that these companies are driven largely by manufacturing and marketing of ultra-processed foods to generate profits through financialization, mostly through channeling more money to shareholders. And you could see that shareholder value has increased to a far greater extent than any other component of our food industry, and that this is intentional, and that the purpose of ultra-processed foods is to increase shareholder payout, to adopting large-scale share buyback programs, by restructuring the company to reduce production costs, including cutting jobs. And along with, and so the conclusions in this paper really were is that shareholder primacy was the major driving force for ultra-processed food corporations, and that this has driven the inequity in our food environment, and that really when we're thinking about fixing the food environment, we need to protect population diets and food systems from these extractive forces that are likely going to have to be addressed in any kind of food population. So what to do? I mean, seriously, what to do? You know, in 2013, a statement came out arguing against defining obesity as a disease. And the American Medical Association Council on Science and the Public Health warned that the medicalization of obesity would detract us from sort of a collective social solution and environmental solutions. And we're probably seeing that prediction come true. Classifying obesity as a disease has not done anything constructive, and it's sort of accelerated this conventional understanding of obesity as an individual problem that has to be addressed by individual medical treatments. And whether that treatment is diet or pharmaceuticals or surgery is up to the individual and their insurance company. And so I still think that collective social solutions could benefit everybody, including addressing the food environment. We need a national food policy. We have no food policy. We have no plan or agreed upon principles for managing American agriculture or our food system as a whole. And that's what we need. And we're nowhere near to developing one. You know, many of the solutions that I suggest to my students in my nutrition classes are just simply not viable options for many people in our socioeconomic stratified country. You know, for many people, they have bigger, more emergent problems than what they're going to eat for dinner. You know, and right now fast food is more affordable, it's more accessible, and they're worried about keeping their job and keeping their car running and keeping their kids safe after school, and it's not one of their priorities. So, and so it's an issue. You know, one of the things that I tell my students, and this is the last slide, is you know, learning to cook is sort of taking control of your food environment out of corporations' hands. And learning how to cook helps you address many of the problems formed by corporate food in our environment. We don't have to worry about salt as much. We don't have to worry about added sugars and salt and high fructose corn syrup. You know, and the Diet Fit study sort of addressed this a little bit. You know, in the Diet Fit study, they sort of looked at two populations of volunteers in this observational study where he counseled one half of the population to adopt a low-fat diet, but to learn how to cook and to avoid sugar as much as possible, to avoid restaurant foods and fast foods, and learn how to cook. And the other one was address low-carb diet. Same thing, avoid sugar, don't avoid eating out and fast foods. And what they found is that when you adopt a whole food diet, you lose weight. And some people lost a lot of weight, a lot of people lost some weight, and a few people gained weight. And so this is very attractive. This is something that a lot of people can do, but we know that a lot of people can't do it. They don't have time. They're taking mass transit to faraway jobs. Vegetables are expensive. They're inherently more expensive than fast food. And so we need to come up with a solution to address that. So I welcome your thoughts. Um, um, and certainly I'm happy to take questions. There's been a lot in the chat. Global best practices from John Grogan is exactly right. But not everybody can do it. And that's the problem. And as much as I'm interested in creating a new population of medical students or physicians that can talk intelligently to their patients about cooking and eating well and remaining active and getting a good night's sleep, they know as well as anybody that not all of their patients are in a position to be able to do this. And so we need to address the inequalities in our country before we can even begin to address some of these other challenges. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Sherman, for your presentation. So as Dr. Myers said, we're going to start with questions from HAPI students, and then afterwards we will allow questions from people outside of the program. All right, go ahead, Margot.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Sherman, for this presentation. I used to work in food policy, so I very much appreciate the way that you laid this issue out of the unhealthy food environment as a systemic issue, because I think a lot of times when I hear people talk about the issue of obesity in this country, it's very victim blaming and it is on the individual level. So I really appreciate how you framed all of this. I guess my question, you touched on it a bit, but I think whenever I see that chart of like all of the food companies, they're all consolidated really among 10 companies, it gets really discouraging. So I was wondering if there are any promising regulation or policies that you've seen to try and like regulate these companies that are either manufacturing these highly processed foods or who are marketing these like weight loss products and medicines.
No, there's just very little regulation on the horizon. I mean, we're still in a Republican-dominated Congress. There's no appetite for further regulation. I think there are some, presidential directives that are being made that can be helpful, but nothing addressing this topic. And it's going to require a realization that this is something that can be addressed by individuals, that it needs to be addressed at the policy level. And I'm just, just like many people believe trickle down economics works. Many people don't believe that regulation leads to constructive things, and yet it clearly does. I mean, we have, maybe not an FDA that we're proud of or anything like that, but there are regulations out there that are working towards keeping us safe. And we could recapitulate that with a national food policy. I just don't see it happening anytime soon.
All right, Dylan, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, thanks so much. So I was sort of interested in kind of what you sort of touched on at the end with sort of the positive impact that like things like having the ability to cook for yourself can have on your health. Specifically like, with things like that, with sort of buying your groceries in terms of like focusing on whole foods and then like going out and cooking for yourself. That's obviously something that, we also talked about tends to cost more, and especially tends to cost more time, right? It's kind of tricky to you can't like cook a meal for yourself by putting something in the microwave for 2 minutes. And so I was wondering how you sort of envision us kind of closing the economic gap there, right? Where it's it might be very easy for someone who is economically sort of in a stable position to go out and cook for themselves and figure that out. But it might be more difficult for someone who doesn't have those privileges. I was just wondering how, if you think there's a policy there that might be able to address that or whatever else, might be able to sort of rectify those issues.
I mean, it's a frustrating question because so really what you're asking is that, just like many women are not in a position to breastfeed because of their work environment or their transportation limitations, and that if you want healthy food, if you want safe dairy products, it's going to cost more. And there are just people out there who can't afford that. And so we need to subsidize foods that benefit people's health and decrease the real cost of inexpensive food, and to tax foods that end up increasing health risks. And there's just no stomach for that right now. And so it's true that fruits and vegetables are just inherently more expensive. They're more fragile. They're much more time consuming compared to commodity crops upon which most fast foods and ultra processed foods are based. But that doesn't mean we can't subsidize those and tax the other. And right now, there's just tremendous waste in the farm system because you know what percent of the grains, the corn and wheat and everything in this country goes towards human food? 11%. And the rest goes to animal food and to fuel generation. And that's just a tremendous waste of farming resources. And that we need to sort of socialize farming and privatize the risks associated with that. So yeah, it's true that some jurisdictions provide vouchers for farmers markets for low-income people, and that's wonderful. And I love those programs. But then those people still have to go and cook those foods, and more power to them, because it's wonderful when they do it, because they want to provide good food for their children. And so I think I see all of these as sort of positive steps that are up against a structurally violent system.
All right. It looks like Kiri O'Connor doesn't have a question, but he did put in a link to say that Colombia has introduced a UPF tax. Just wanted to put that.
That's actually very interesting. That's the first one that I've seen. That there is you're all familiar with efforts to tax sugar, or to tax sodas. And it's a really interesting development because it's sort of a recognition that these are products that are harming the people and that we're trying to hold them responsible. And they do work. I mean, they're not tremendous successes, but they do work. And one of the consequences of these sugar taxes, especially as opposed to soda taxes, is that they're sort of forcing companies to decrease the amount of sugar in their products, just like many of these efforts to publicize, these massive meals that you can get at some restaurants, that hold a day or 2 days worth of calories in a single meal. It's sort of forcing companies to downsize their meals a little bit because they're tired of being shamed in public. So I see these as positive steps.
So Rayanna, my suggestion is that with Dr. Sherman's really tough schedule today, that we maybe take one or two more quick questions. I just want to interject that there is no seminar next week. The week after, we have the last seminar of the calendar year by Shaniqua Collier of GW, who's going to talk about some of the issues of social justice and precision medicine, which I think will be relevant to some of the comments that Dr. Sherman's made. So Rayanna, sorry for the interruption.
No worries. I was just thinking the same thing. So I was just gonna ask for any last questions if anyone has them. But I'm not seeing any raised hands. But I will put Dr. Sherman's email into the chat if anyone has any questions. He's been so kind to share that and allow us to go ahead and email him after the session. But yeah, oh, okay, sorry. Go ahead.
Remember, I'll be seeing some of you at 4 o'clock in the Biology of Health and Disease course, because I'm lecturing today on a very different topic.
Yeah, so yeah, anyone that's in the HAPI program, that's going to be in bio later today, Dr. Sherman will be our lecturer. But Jasmine, if you want to go ahead and ask a quick last question.
Great. Yeah. I actually be there, so I'll see you later. In the biology class. But thank you so much for this great run through. I thought it was a really interesting presentation. On the regulatory piece, what would that look like? Like if you could have like the ideal like policy. I know there's several different approaches that can be taken here, but like what would like the ideal like regulatory proposal look like? And just like high level, curious on your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think about that all the time, and I don't have a good solution. I really don't. But part of it would sort of, once we realize, for example, that cigarette companies were manipulating caffeine, nicotine levels to make them maximally addictive. Once we realized that they were purposely manipulating nicotine levels, then that gave us a target for lawsuits. And now that we know, based on the wonderful work by Michael Moss and others, that food companies are specifically targeting combinations of salt, sugar, and fat to make their foods as addictive as possible, then there is a sense in which we can begin to hold them responsible, and we just need the sort of collective will to begin to do so. And so legislating limits on added sugar, the new food, I forget what it's called, the nutritional facts label on foods specifically now lists added sugar. So we know how many added sugars are in food. So that helps consumers a little bit, but limiting how much salt. We know that on a population level, overconsumption of salt is a tremendous risk for increased heart disease. So these are knowns that we can begin to limit. Whether or not that's going to significantly impact the ultra-processed food industry, I don't know. But it's a challenge. I would love to be part of it. I'm sure I won't be. So, but thank you, Jasmine, and I'll see you soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Well, it was a pleasure meeting all of you. Thank you so much for attending. My older brother was here. My mother-in-law was here. Very exciting.
That's great, and we encourage speakers to invite their own audience as well. Great talk today. Rayanna, excellent job, and we'll welcome all of you back in 2 weeks for our final presentation of the year. Thanks again, Tom.
Take care, everybody.